After months and months of waiting, Audit's history is back. Okay? So, I am the number one rival to Heimler, do not forget. So this is chapter 11, which is just talking about Jefferson's presidency and the beginning of Madison's presidency leading up to the War of 1812. So, we're gonna just start off with a brief, quick thing with Adams. So the thing is that at the very end of Adams' presidency, right before, so during the election, Adams is going to lose. It's really close. But Aaron Burr manages to, who's running with Jefferson as his VP, manages to turn over New York to the Democratic Republicans by just doing like a big campaign and just like going and being very organized. In contrast, the Federalists aren't as well organized, but they do, and also they're not really popular because after Adams managed to avoid war with France through the Convention of 1800, no one's like, they're just like, bro, why did you make this huge military and raise a bunch of taxes? Like, they literally made a stamp tax. Like, yikes. That's a bad look for them. And so they did a bunch of things, like, just to try and raise an army, but then they just didn't end up having to use it because Adams managed to get peace with France. So, yeah, then because of that, the Republicans managed to win, and they do like this big like campaign against Jefferson. They're like, Jefferson, like, he actually slept with the slaves, which actually did turn out to be true. But they also just did a bunch of things like, oh, Jefferson, you're an atheist, you wanted the separation of church and state, that's crazy. So anyways, so Jefferson calls his victory the Revolution of 1800, and this is like my timeline here. He calls it the Revolution of 1800, not because there was like some huge change or anything, but just because like it's a peaceful transition of power, which is pretty crazy actually for the time. And also, Jefferson sees this as a return to the ideals of the revolution. And I think the biggest impact, the reason why it's really a revolution, is because you have two people who are really disagreeing with each other, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. But they peacefully transfer the power, and that starts a tradition which is unbroken in America until January 6, 2021, which is absolutely insane. So after that, so Adams is lost, and so he passes what's called the Judiciary Act of 1801. This adds 16 new judges to different areas, and Adams appoints these federal judges to have to be Federalist appointees. And so these judges are called the Midnight Judges because supposedly he was signing them all like until the last day, like approving these judges. And so this makes sure that the Federalists will have some sort of power. So now we get over into Jefferson's presidency. Adams's presidency is over. So Jefferson just like doesn't really feel like giving these midnight judges the actual commission to become the judge. And so they repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801. And remember, this is different from the one in 1789. The Judiciary Act of 1789 just established the federal court system in the first place. All this is doing is that this is simply saying that that they're just adding some new posts. So what happens is that this one person who was appointed to be a judge, William Marbury, gets like kind of pissed that like he's supposed to be a federal judge, but then they're just not giving it to him. So he sues Madison, who's the Secretary of State who was supposed to give it to him. And then that causes this court case which goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's kind of in a pickle here because they're kind of screwed no matter which side they side with. The Chief Justice, John Marshall, is a Federalist, but also like if he like supports the Federalists and says orders the government to pass and orders the government to like give the commission to Marbury, they're probably just gonna ignore him, and that's gonna make the Supreme Court look weak and sets a bad precedent. So what he does instead is that he says that he just throws out the case and he establishes the concept of judicial review, the idea that the Supreme Court can decide what is constitutional and what is not. Remember, Jefferson in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions had said that the states have that power, but here they say the Supreme Court has that power, which is pretty crazy. And this is actually probably the most important court case in all of U.S. history. Marbury versus Madison. Okay, Marbury versus Madison establishes judicial review because it says that The Judiciary Act of 1789, remember, not the 1801, the 1789 one, which basically gave them power to issue that command, was unconstitutional because the Supreme Court didn't have that power. But the details are important. Just remember, Marbury versus Madison makes judicial review a thing, which is crazy. Okay, so after that, we're gonna head on over to the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so the Louisiana Purchase, Napoleon's trying to conquer all of Europe, and see, the thing is that Spain had been like in some negotiations to give France all of Louisiana, and that means that like New Orleans and stuff are being closed, which is bad for American shipping, because they won't need to ship through New Orleans, and so they're like, ugh, like Spain's kind of like getting weak right now, so we can negotiate with them, but France, nah. So what we gotta do is that they say, okay, France, look up, look here. We're going to purchase all of Louisiana from you. So Jefferson sends some delegates. He says, here's $10 million. Go and get Louisiana, and if not, we're going to war with France. So they do that, and they get all of Louisiana and a ton of land for 15 million, and then they come back. Now, this kind of presents a constitutional problem because Jefferson was a strict contextualist. Remember, he said that you should follow exactly what's said in the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't give the president the power to make these kinds of negotiations and treaties to buy all this land. So Jefferson kind of has to compromise here because practically this is actually really important. If he waits longer, Napoleon might revoke his deal. So yeah, he manages to get this really good deal to get all of this land, and because Napoleon's trying to focus on his conflicts with Europe, and he's not and he didn't really need Louisiana because they lost the territory of Haiti, so which they plan to supply with Louisiana. So they get all of Louisiana, and then that's where the Lewis and Clark expedition happens as a result. Because now that you've got all this land, now we want to survey it. So Lewis and Clark go throughout all and have a big expedition where they go all throughout the Louisiana territory, throughout and all the way to the Pacific coast. And they show that it is possible to go by land all the way to all the way west, and so that's pretty cool. And they managed to map out a huge amount of land and interact with a ton of natives. Then, so that was like kind of a bit of a side quest. But back to like other foreign affairs. So the French and the British are getting really annoying. Okay, that's the next thing on our timeline because basically remember they're fighting each other because Napoleon's trying to conquer all of Europe, Britain's trying to fight the French, so they're like fighting each other. Okay, so what happens is that France says that okay, you can't trade at the British at any British ports, and in retaliation Britain passes these orders of council which basically say that okay, you cannot you can't trade with any of the French ports without going through a British port first. So either way, the U.S. is cooked. There's no way they can trade with either country, and they can't trade with anyone. And so that's kind of a problem because the U.S. needs to trade. So and what happens even further with this is that there's this thing called impressment. Okay, impressment is where the British they take some seamen on a like some people like sailors on a U.S. ship, and then they will say, okay, you're gonna become a British Navy person now, and so yeah, that's not really great, and so the U.S. is very pissed about this, and many people actually end up dying in service to the British Navy. Then, even more annoying is what's called the Chesapeake Affair, where basically this U.S. ship called the Chesapeake supposedly had 4 British deserters on it, and this is like right off the coast of Virginia, and like some British ship comes in, and then they say like, okay, give it the deserters, and so like the U.S. And then like the captain's like, nah, I don't feel like it, and so then they just attack the ship, and then kill several people on board, and wound a lot more, and this is like obviously wrong, right? And this is pretty, this leads to even more resentment, which causes what's called the Embargo Act of 1807, which is pretty crazy actually. They say, Jefferson says, we are not trading with any country in the world. No country can trade with us. And Jefferson's idea here is like, okay, Britain and France are really dependent on us for exports. So if we pass this, then they're going to be so sad that they're going to say, okay, we're going to remove the order of the council. We're going to let you trade with us freely. Trust. So, but this doesn't really happen. The U.S. is just overestimating their importance. Like, they're just an irrelevant bozo. Like, like if like Micronesia decided to ban all trade, no one's gonna care. It's the same thing here. No one cares that the U.S. has stopped trading. They massively overestimated their own importance, and so as a result, they're just the U.S. economy is gonna be hurt really badly, and all the other countries don't really care. So the interesting thing is Jefferson was really pro farmer, but this actually would end up helping manufacturing in the long run, because obviously if you can't export and import, if you can't import or export things from other countries, you're gonna have to produce things locally. So this leads to American manufacturing increasing a ton, which is quite interesting. And after that, the like things are still not really like super great. So then what he does what's called so towards the end of his presidency, he passes what's called the Non-Intercourse Act, where he says that they're not going to have like relations with Britain or France, but they can trade with other countries. So basically, you can trade with any country except Britain and France. And this is where we kind of get to the end of Jefferson's presidency. I wanted to briefly go on the side here to talk about Aaron Burr, because he was a key term. So during Jefferson's first term in office, Aaron Burr was his VP candidate, but then for a second term, Jefferson dropped him, which was probably a good idea, because Burr is gonna run for governor of New York and stuff, and he's gonna get really annoyed at Hamilton, so he's gonna challenge Hamilton to a duel and kill him, which is like not a good look for him. And then after that, Burr is also gonna like start this plot to make this like little empire in the West, like, and so people see him as a traitor too. So probably a good thing that Jefferson dropped him as a candidate. So I think that's pretty much everything we need to know from Jefferson's presidency. But let's just move on to Madison now. So the thing is that there's a faction of the Democratic Republicans now who are quote unquote war hawks, okay? And these war hawks are pretty like mad at the British, because they're saying like, oh, British very bad. They say they're funding the Native Americans to fight the Americans, and that they're obviously doing like this impressment stuff, right? Which is not very good. And also the Chesapeake affair, not a great look for them. So the war hawks say we must go to war with Britain, and so they're a pretty vocal minority. And so, speaking of the British funding Native Americans, there's this one guy, Tecumseh, and he and his brother is called the Prophet, because he's a religious leader. So he and the Prophet are going to basically help make a big confederacy of Native American tribes in the Northwest, and they're going to try and beat up the Americans. But unfortunately, and so Tecumseh is a great leader, but he's defeated in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. And so with that, the Confederacy begins to somewhat weaken, and they're forced to seek British support. And so they ally with the British. Later in the War of 1812, which is next unit, Tecumseh is gonna die, and with that, the hopes of a huge Native American Confederacy also die out. Now, remember the Non-Intercourse Act from earlier? Well, a really stupid act is passed after that called McConn's Bill Number 2. And this bill basically says, okay, so Britain and France, look here. If one of you promises to remove your restrictions, we're gonna stop trading with the other country. We're gonna put an embargo on them. But in the meantime, they just resume trade with both countries. It's a stupid bill because it puts all the power in the hands of these two countries. And it's going to push the US towards war with Britain, because what Napoleon's going to do is he's going to say, all right, guys, trust me. So if Britain removes their restrictions, I'm going to remove my restrictions. Trust me. So then, I mean, like, everybody's like, yeah, we won. We're so cool, guys. So they put the restriction on Britain, And now they're even more annoyed at Britain. It's like because Britain just refuses to remove their restrictions, and so that pushes the U.S. even more towards war. And I think I've pretty much covered everything in this chapter, but yeah. Just remember here's the timeline. Just remember, there's a few little groups of linked events. For example, like the Judiciary Act, the Midnight Judges in Marbury v. Madison, they're all linked together. The Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark, these are all linked together too. Then also like everything with the French and the British, right? The French and British being annoying, the Chesapeake Affair, the Embargo Act, Non-Intercourse Act, and McConnell's Bill number 2, they're also closely linked together. So you just need to remember that there's these little groups of events which are closely linked together. And as long as you remember that, you should be good for the exam. Okay, bye.